off by saying good evening. Hello and welcome. This is our Exaflix Hidden Figures panel discussion. So some of us have just been watching the film. It lasts about 2 hours long, and it tells the story of Dorothy Vaughan, Catherine. Yep, that's it. Yeah. And we're going to meet our panelists. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of our panelists. So tonight, joining us, we have Nicky, Danino, Adrienne, Rohini, Shah, and Peter Hoath. And I'm going to ask each of them just to give us a little bit of an introduction to themselves, so we understand where your opinions may be coming from. And then, as you're also introducing yourself, if you wouldn't mind maybe picking out a scene, a particular bit in the film that's some kind of abiding memory of one of your favorite scenes or something. So is it okay if we go with Nicky, then Adrienne, then Rohini, and Peter, if we go in that order? Okay.
Yep, sure. Hi, my name's Nicky Danino, and I am an academic lead for computer science at the University of Central Lancashire. My background's in computer science, and whatever people tell you that it's getting better and more girls are picking computer science, it is not true. I think it's a misconception. If you look at the data, the number of women that have picked A-level computer science has actually gone down this year. It's not going up. So why did I pick it? I went to a girls' school, so single-sex education. I am convinced it made a massive difference to me, because there was nobody telling me, don't do that, that's for boys, because guess what, there weren't any boys at my school. But my main influence was my mother. She was a policewoman when women were not policewomen. You know, nobody told my mother what to do. She reminds me so much of Mary from the movie. You know, that was my mom. Mm-hmm. And I'm a big believer in doing outreach work, because for me, I think for little girls especially, if you can't see it, you can't be it. So it's a really important thing to show those girls real role models in front of them and examples of what they can aspire to be. So that's where I'm coming from anyway.
And Mary Jackson, she was a great role model in terms
favorite superhero, of course. Wonder Woman.
Fantastic. So who did I say was next? Was it Adrienne?
Okay. I'm Adrienne Taff, and I'm head of computing at a startup school. My part of the film which probably stuck with me, one of my favourite scenes, was when Catherine made a scene about the fact that she had to walk all the way to the bathroom and was gone for 40 minutes, and then obviously her supervisor made a big deal about it, although I think that weren't actually factually accurate, I've read, but I think it was just a really kind of like pivotal point of the film. I think it really got you like appreciating what they were going through, and I just think it's just a nice way to, I just think she conveyed the emotion really well, and a good way, sorry, Nicky said, to kind of highlight the representation or the segregation, I should say, of women and men in computing, which again is like another passion of mine, to really increase females. I know obviously the whole toilet issue was about the segregation of colour, but I still do think it can be like applicable to the segregation of men and women. And for us, we're in a mixed school, and it is quite obvious, and it always has been in the mixed schools, of the boys who kind of dominate in their teenage years, and then the females who kind of feel a little bit more timid. So I think this is a really great film to show the female students.
Yeah, she I think she actually said it was like going to Timbuktu in the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, that outburst was quite something. So Rohini, are you going to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Rohini Shah. I work at Queen's Park Community School in London. I've been there for 17 years. So I've done the head of department and all that. And now I'm just a part-time teacher promoting all the computer sciencey issues, like encouraging more girls and getting them to like programming. etc. This film has a very, very close link to me because I am born in Zambia in Central Africa, and my mother was born in South Africa. And I remember going to visit my grandparents who used to live in Orange Province, in a small town called Louis Tricard. And those signs that you saw there, the non-colored toilets and the colored toilets, you know, the white ladies and non-white ladies, I've actually experienced that as a teenager. So, you know, recently, with all the stuff that's going on with Black Lives Matter, you know, I found that this was such a lovely film because it's so empowering. And, you know, working in a central London school, that we have a very, very mixed community. And, you know, these women, honestly, I just think it's what we are promoting, that, you know, work hard and nothing is impossible. And I guess, you know, I've got a whole list of things that I really, really enjoyed about the film. But one of the things that really, really stuck to me was the words "maths is dependable." I just love that quote, "Maths is dependable." And it's true. You know, now that I think about it, you know, facts are facts. You know, you can't argue. You can't argue with that, can you? That's too much. Thank you.
Thank you. And Peter, you're our final panelist joining us this evening. Tell us a little bit about you and your favorite part of the film.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, my name's Peter, and I'm well, I'm retired, but I was in communication security before I jumped off the corporate hamster wheel. I'm now a guide, a member of the learning team at the National Museum of Computing on Bletchley Park, which I greatly enjoy. It's the best job I ever had. It's not really a job because you enjoy. Maybe you guys enjoy doing what you do, but I do. So I do get involved with teachers a lot, and I wouldn't have a teaching job for a gold clock. I have unbelievable admiration for you folks. I can say goodbye to the kids after maybe a half a day or 3/4 of a day. But no, that sounds slightly cynical. It's not right. I do enjoy every minute of it. One of my favourite bits, and this is the geek in me coming out here, was when Dorothy Vaughan fixed the IBM 7090 by moving an oscilloscope probe from one place to another. If only life was that simple. Okay, I'd be a genius. And because something very similar has happened to me. It wasn't an oscilloscope probe. It was actually a telephone exchange that wasn't working. And it was a single wire that was in the wrong place. It was in Grangemouth in Scotland, as it happens, but donkey's ages ago. And I was lauded as some kind of demigod by the engineers on at that place, because I'd driven all the way up from London to Grangemouth. And I was expecting to stay there for at least 5 or 6 days. I'd finished it within 20 minutes of arriving there. And so I can resonate to Dorothy Vaughan moving the scope probe and suddenly making it work. Of course, that's unreal. And there's quite a lot of non-real things about the movie. But that's the kind of detail freak that I am.
It's interesting, actually, because nowadays there's very little hardware component to a computer science.
Precisely. You can't get in and play with it. It's so tiny. It's at atomic scale components, and it all happens by magic, seemingly.
So I'm going to move on to the first question. So thank you to all our panelists for joining us. There was something as I was watching again this evening, and I was a little distracted because I wanted to make sure everybody was able to join us in that. And it occurred to me, the same as with the Imitation Game last month, there's a huge load of stories all packed in. Like, and even you could say there's nearly 20, 50 years history all crammed into 2 hours. And that may cause a problem. And I'm just wondering if it's clear to you what kind of messages the director was trying to get across, and whether you think the film is successful in terms of getting those messages.
Shall I go?
Yeah, sure.
think the message that I think the director was probably trying to that I took away was the hard work and perseverance and not giving up. You know, don't give up. If you want something, you know, go after it. Like Mary did when she spoke to the judge. And okay, the judge had his own peculiarities, you know, that he was the first one in his family or something like that. There was something like that. And, you know, the words that she used was, you know, there's always a first, isn't there? What's wrong with being that first? And even today, there's always going to be a first, isn't there?
That's right. In that scene, what I recall is she says something to the judge, look, I can't change my skin color.
Yes, that's
but
right.
You can change this. So, you know, and you know, I can't speak from that aspect of prejudice, but I know there's times in life when we all, in one way or other, we do feel like the odds are stacked up against us. And yeah, so there was a good message in there. Like, if you really, really want to achieve something, no matter what the odds say or whatever, then by all means give it a go. So it's quite an empowering message.
It is, yeah.
Do you think that's the only message, everybody else, or do you think there's other valuable lessons?
Well, it's been 6 years since Rosa Parks, and nothing much seems to have changed. And admittedly, Virginia was I believe was a late state to abolish segregation. But I think that was quite stark, really. That the other thing that struck me was the principal characters, Catherine Goebel and Mary Jackson, were quite comfortably off, if I can put it that way, in their own community.
Do you mean
I don't know why that came as a surprise, really.
How they're portrayed in the film, or
yeah, and this is entirely down to portrayal in the film. I don't know what the real life situation was, but one hopes they've got some historical accuracy there. But so maybe is that a secondary effect of their innate intelligence, that they were brought up in a way in a I wouldn't say affluent, but a not poor household. It's just an image I got of it. Within their own communities, and it's bad that the communities were segregated. They were not oppressed within their own communities. However, when you take the overall picture, there was a whole load of it going on there, and I thought that was quite theatrically portrayed, but well done. I mean, it's a film that was simply 2 hours and 7 minutes of non-boredom. It was amazing. There was not a minute in that whole film that I wasn't riveted to it. And I saw it in 2017, shortly after it was released. That was the first time on an aeroplane about this size, so it was hard to watch. But I was absolutely captivated by it then. I saw it through at least 1.5 times, actually. I watched it again, but ran out of time.
I didn't get the impression that Catherine was particularly wealthy, at least not with her family, because if I'm right, and I did watch this a while ago and then again last week, but you know, lots of things have come up since. But wasn't it near the beginning of the film when she her community kind of like rallied together and they all donated to put money in so that she could go to that school?
Yes.
And I think, and then obviously with her pals, it was Catherine, wasn't it, who made a comment about you know, how little they were paid. And for me, I think one of the key things which I've taken away from the film, or that I did when I'd watched it, was the hidden figures. It's like, it actually, they're not doing it for their recognition, they're doing it because it's their passion. And that's something that they love to do despite all the barriers. And I think that's quite a powerful thing to kind of take from it and to motivate with the students, that there's going to be loads of barriers, but if it's your passion and it's what you're really interested in, then you can still succeed. Even if you don't get the recognition right now, there's nothing to say that you won't in the future.
Yeah, that's almost contradictory though, because there are 20% more jobs in computer science than there are graduates. So if you come and study computer science, you will get the recognition because you will get paid and you will get a good job. Yeah. So even though you've got a really good point, the outcome is still going to be good for them. You know, I mean, there's not enough people. Certainly the STEM gap in this country is getting bigger, not smaller, in terms of need and supply and demand, you know. So it's a...
So the film, The film, it tells a fairly accurate historical story, and so things like the civil rights movement, and it's apparent that as you're watching the film, you think, oh my gosh, things have changed since. But then at the same time, you're reminded of things like there's a protest, almost a Black Lives Matter protest. And you think, have things really moved on? Did you find that contrast was portrayed well in the film? Were there certain things that stood out as being the same or different?
I mean, my passion for activism comes from equality in gender. So I have less to say about the Black rights movement, I suppose. But for me, I think what's happened in terms of equality of women in STEM areas and STEM careers is not that the equality is not that difference between men and women is disappearing, is that it's becoming less visible. And that's not the same thing, is it? It's becoming less visible because people are probably sick of hearing it. They're saying, oh, it's fine now, everything's okay, it's sorted. And also, I think that women can be somewhat penalized for speaking out if they feel that they're not being treated equally. And I'm sorry, I actually forgot to talk about my favorite part in the movie, but one of the things that really struck me was when Mary Jackson talked about, when she was talking about becoming an engineer, and she talked about how when she actually gets to the point where she's given them everything they want, every chance she gets to equalize things, they move the finishing line for her. And I thought that was really interesting because that really resonates with me now, but it's done far more subtly now than it was then, but it's still there. So those inequalities that were maybe more visible in the 60s and 70s are still here. They're just more hidden now.
And Nicky, you make a very, very good point, because I noticed at one point when she wanted to apply for the engineering, her husband was putting her off as well.
Well, he needs her to stay home and look after the kids because he's not.
Yeah. So he was putting her off, but also when Catherine, no, not Catherine, the other lady, Dorothy, when Dorothy was looking for the
book in the library,
the supervisor's role, like women, sometimes women don't support other women.
Yeah. Of course we don't.
Yeah, there's a scene in the bathroom where Dorothy is in the bathroom and her female colleague comes out and she says, oh, just to let you know, she basically says, like, I'm not racist. And Dorothy Vaughan replies something like, yes, I'm sure you don't think you are. Ouch. Yeah. So I'm going to move on to another question. So my wife, when my wife hears things that I'm doing and talking about, she just switches off. She's not interested at all. But
that is not true, Alan. I've met you.
But of all the films, this one, she sat down and she said, this is absolutely amazing. Why have you never made me watch this film before? And the question I'd be asking now the panel is, do you think this is a good film to show people who don't necessarily have an interest in science, technology, computing? Would you feel happy showing it to other members of your family, relatives?
Yeah, definitely.
Is there a particular example where you can think, oh, look, and would you make them watch the full 2 hours, or would you say, just look at this scene here,
I would make them watch the whole 2 hours because I know my family, and if you show them a snippet of a film, then they're just going to ask me loads more questions. So save myself the time. They're just going to watch it. But I just think the underlying messages are powerful, regardless if you're interested in STEM or not. I watched this a few years ago where I wasn't as passionate as what I am now within my computing role. And I just thought it's a film which is quite inspirational and quite uplifting, which is nice. It's a nice film to recommend to people. Like, it's kind of a feel-good film, and I don't really think you can watch it and not feel happy with it. Like, it just has such like nice things to take away from it, and I think it's something which I definitely recommend for the students, even if they feel like they're not interested in any of our subjects that we teach. It's still a nice thing for them to watch, because regardless, hard work and whatever you choose to do is a good thing to promote.
Yes.
And it pays off in the end.
Definitely. I think the contrast, there's a contrast to the Imitation Game here for me in particular, because I found the Imitation Game very irritating in that the balance between the overall storyline of Turing's issues and the way he was treated was more or less equal with the technical content, and the technical content was rubbish.
Mm-hmm.
Contrast that to this one, you've got a whole load of angst about the segregation issue, and there's technical content in there, and it's kind of portrayed in an easily accessible way, and that's a subtle way of saying not very accurately, with all the formulae on the board and all that nonsense, dy by dt, and I could see some pretty darn made up equations on those boards, but that's not the point. There was a better balance of believable technology, even though it was wrong, and the thrust of the story about the privations they had to put up with, and the way they drove through it, and the feel good attitude of that coming through. A much better balanced film, which is why it riveted me for the full 2 hours. Whereas I got irritated with the other one.
Yeah, I felt actually with this one though, it felt like it was wrapped up really well. I think the Imitation Game always felt a little bit rushed at the end. And another one that comes to mind is Made in Dagenham. Love that film, but it always felt really rushed at the end. Whereas this had a really, really nice wrap up, didn't it? You kind of felt when you walked away that there was nothing left for it. It didn't.
Well, there was, and there were some points in there where my eyes started leaking, and I mean that's typical for me, because I tend to get emotional at stories like that. It's sad, isn't it? Really. But,
No.
and there was no obvious reason why. It was just, and that's the skill of the cinematography, I think, and the storyline, and the acting was superb. Even I could even suspend belief that Sheldon Cooper was a baddie.
Yes. So that leads in very nicely. So you might have noticed that Peter and myself are male, and as I was watching the film, I did in some ways think like, oh my God, did this, and some of it, as we're saying, is still going on today. Were there certain male characters that you felt you would want to champion or celebrate in the film because of how they were? And were there others that you would want to, ostracize and say, like, so that, later on we might point to one as an example and say, now, who are you being like now, Peter? Are you being more like, Kevin Costner's character? Or are you being,
Well, I'd certainly identify more with Al Harrison than but Paul Stafford was a made-up character anyway. He was a composite, I believe. But they crammed all those distasteful sort of elements into the one human being, which is probably slightly unreal. But certainly, I would definitely identify with Al Harrison. You could see how conflicted he was, because he's simply wrapped up in his own work to the detriment of his surroundings, of observing what was going on around him, and the coffee story and all that sort of stuff. That whether they happened or not, it didn't much matter. You didn't sort of say to yourself, "Well, I wonder if that really happened." It served to aid the storyline, the arc of the story to me, and like knocking the sign off the wall, that never happened either. But that was except they didn't do it very well. That sign should have come down a lot easier than it did, and then that's the engineering me coming through. He was whacking 7 colours of I don't know what out of that with whatever it was, a baseball bat or something, and that really should have just fallen off the wall on about the 3rd blow. I know that's silly, but those little interjections.
I really liked Oleg Krupa, and I looked him up, and I know he's fictional. He's the Polish immigrant, and Polish Jewish immigrant, and I thought that was a really nice way as well to get that kind of Jewish underdog in there, to show that also people who are not the straightforward white American man can also be successful. But one of the things that I think, one of the themes that came out very strongly with that relationship with him and Mary, and is still very prevalent today, is that actually, if you want to be a successful female in sciences, the role of a mentor is crucial. It is absolutely crucial. You cannot do it without them. You cannot do it on your own. It's very, very difficult. And obviously, Mary had that mentor in him, you know. And actually, when I read about Catherine's, the real Catherine, I believe she had a lot of mentoring because she graduated university when she was a teenager. And that was only possible because lots of people mentored her through that maths journey that she did very early on. And she would not have been able to do it without them.
There was a point, wasn't there, in the film when Kirsten Dunst's character, Vivian Mitchell, says to Dorothy Vaughan, "We've got a job for you. We want to," and Dorothy says, "Nope, you're going to need, it's not just me. You need all of my colleagues with me." I'm sorry, Adrienne, I jumped in just as you started.
That's okay. Someone else I would champion, but I can't remember his name. You know, the one that they actually flew, the astronaut, and when they were like checking the numbers, and he said, I want the girl to check it. Obviously, it's not good that he didn't know her name, but I think it's also taken the positive spin from it, the fact that there's so many male workers there, but he's still recognizing her, not for the gender. It's just that he's admitting to everyone else that she is the best and she deserves to get that recognition. And it kind of spoke volumes that it was her who he really trusted, and he didn't want to do the flight unless she was kind of supporting the figures. And I think that's something which is quite brave, isn't it, to kind of like go against the almost like the societal norms and champion almost like the underdog. So yeah, I like that part of the film.
I didn't actually like the astronauts. I thought they were a little bit patronizing, just by calling the girl is really patronizing.
There's some books, there's some material that's been written by some of these astronauts, and they are swine. They really are. They've got the right stuff, but they're horrible people, almost to a man.
You have to be very elitist.
They're driven.
Yeah, very, very elitist to do that kind of job. So it's nice that he kind of pointed her out, but maybe the reason he pointed her out is because she was the only female, and that's what attracted him to her, you know. And the fact he called her a girl, it's like, oh, let's have the girl along, sort of thing. It's I really didn't like any of the astronauts. I think they portrayed that very I've got to be careful what I say here, but you know, the alpha male acceptable role from the 60s. It was
exactly what they were, though. Yeah, they were lauded for it, and so they, you know, self perpetuating. But that John Glenn story was half true. I mean, he did ask for the girl that had done the original calculations to check them, but he didn't meet her at the lineup, so that bit was made up. But and so it's nice that they got the real bit in there, the fact that he trusted those calculations. Now, whether or not he knew she was coloured or not, we don't know. I don't think that I've not read any detailed information about that.
I thought there was an interesting move that we saw a lot of romance and family and social on behalf of the three female lead characters. But we didn't see that with any of the male characters whatsoever. And when I've watched some of the documentaries around like Apollo 11, there was a lot of broken marriages because basically you're being told you have to, you know, work on the base 22 hours a day or something like that. So, and yes, and a lot of marriages at the time were unable to sustain that level of contact. Do you think it was important to see Catherine's home life, Mary Jackson's home life, and the romance? Do you think that added to the film?
I do.
I think it was intentional. I think it's intentional. I hear what you're saying with the men not being shown, but I think it's kind of like a thing, isn't it, that with women, rightly or wrongly, the view is that you choose a career, you choose family, and I think, and obviously that isn't always true, but it does come to a point where it seems like you do have to sacrifice one part or the other. And I think that was kind of like an issue which they showed really well, because it was a conflict of being at home with the children or working. And while you could say the same for the men, the society's expectations of the men is very different to the woman being at home. And obviously we've come like leaps and bounds from what it was in the 60s, but I still feel like the conflict is there for people. So I actually think that was something as well which I really liked about this film, because it resonates, I think, with people, to kind of, you really sympathize with them, because the kids are really cute and you want mum to be at home with the kids, but then you also like champion mum to go and do what she loves and the passion. It's just trying to find the balance.
I agree with everything you've said, apart from that we've come on in leaps and bounds since the 60s. Again, I'm not sure we have. And if anyone's interested who's listening in, I recommend you read some of Laura Bates' work. She's got 2 fantastic books out about sexism, and they're all data-driven, which I think is really the key here. So she presents the data. We talked about facts before and how you can't argue with facts. Then look at some of Laura Bates' work. You'd be astounded at what's going on. It's just not as
Nicky. Agree with you, Nicky, completely. I don't think that it's perfectly, as if people have moved on with those. And I've got a few quotes here. Harrison said, call your wives. I will understand if you can't work late. And I've got a question here. Was that a really supportive comment? I will understand if you can't work late. I mean, he was only talking to Catherine at the time, because she doesn't have a wife, does she? Right? So it wasn't really supportive. And then the other thing that he said was, good work, gentlemen. Good work, gentlemen. Go and have dinner with your kids. Well, what about her?
Yeah, but when Peter came on before, he called us all guys.
Yeah.
It works.
It's not really. It's not. Really, it's not that much.
It's. I actually really hate the term guys. Really, really don't like it. It's become acceptable, but I don't like it.
No, I try to use folks, but sometimes I slip.
Yeah, folks is a really good one. That's a really good one.
Guys is an interesting one. It can divide a room, because I have female friends who say, no, when I see guys as being inclusive, and then others say that it's not. But what is, in a way, the film is prompting us to reflect upon the language that we use. And I think surely that's a good thing, if that we are. So the film raises questions as well, doesn't it? It doesn't just sort of say, and they all lived happily ever after, and NASA named 3 buildings. Well, in the film, at the time of the film, 2 buildings were named at Langley after them, and then recently we've heard that another building. Do you think there's other questions that the film raises that haven't yet been answered or addressed?
Well, there's the underlying question of why are they spending so much money in the space program when they haven't got people they can even feed on the streets, but I guess maybe that's probably outside the scope of this discussion. It's really interesting because when they got stopped, one of the first scenes that I really quite like is when they've broken down and they're in the car, and the sheriff or the policeman that stops them starts looking up and starts going, "Oh, those Russians, they're watching us." And it's about this perception of American society, how they have to be the best and the first at everything, the first in space. And when you look at the resources that they actually spent on the space program, when they've got so many other needs going on in the rest of the country, it's almost illogical, isn't it?
100%.
It's basically so many things. That whole fear of the Russians. I mean, that's the McCarthyism still writ large. And the persecution of the movie industry. Douglas Trumbull, not Trumbull. Oh God, the guy that Bryan Cranston. I said it. The man that Bryan Cranston played on.
Well, guy's okay because you're talking about a guy.
Trumbo. That was it. Now there's a good film. Watch that, because that's all about persecution of a apparent coy sympathiser. And he wasn't. That's the whole thing about it. He just wasn't. So he made films under aliases. He still made some very successful films. Brilliant film. Bryan Cranston's excellent. Walter White in Breaking Bad. But as I'm sure you know, God, I'm mansplaining. I do apologise. So it that scene where they fix the car, where the sheriff arrives and they get the chat going. Again, this is the geek in me coming out now. She fixes the car by short-circuiting the battery and suddenly bursts into life.
Yeah.
No, don't think so. She's been crawling around underneath saying the starter motor's broken. And then she goes and shorts the battery out and it works. That could have been executed better.
It's for visual effects.
It just fell apart that little bit for me. But it just also goes to show how good the rest of the film was, that those things are irritation.
There's a couple of things, actually. I think that scene is really important. There's the bit as well when he says, "Oh, I didn't realize that they hired those."
Yes.
And he goes,
Yeah.
"Oh, yes, lots of women work at NASA." You know, and what he meant was coloured.
Yes, exactly. He couldn't bring himself to say it, could he? And that was interesting. Nice.
Even though they all had different levels of intelligence. I mean, one of the questions is how to measure intelligence, obviously, because we don't know actually what intelligence means. But I thought Dorothy Vaughan was the sharp one. She was probably the more experienced one, the one who could deal with people.
Politically savvy.
Students all the time.
Yeah.
Do you know what? I can teach a monkey to program. You can teach a monkey to program, but if you want to be good at computer science, you need to learn to deal with people.
That's true.
Nicky, do you remember the scene? Do you remember the scene where Dorothy Vaughan is in the library and the librarian reaches over the shelf and she says, "What are you doing?"
With the two boys, yeah.
Yes. And she says, "I'm looking for a book." He says, "We don't want you causing trouble." It's like, that's what. But again, where has this librarian's prejudice stemmed from? Had black people been in the library before and they'd thrown books all over the place? You know, where does this come from? Has somebody said to her, "Oh, we can't have black people in, because if they do, this is what they do," or "I know somebody"? So,
but where has female prejudice stemmed from? I have previously been asked in a meeting full of men whether I was there for note taking.
Oh, that's dreadful.
And actually, do you know what I said? I said, "No, are you?" That didn't go down. But you know, where has that prejudice stemmed from? Why, as a female, was I perceived to be there to take notes? Unfortunately, it so happens that the other female in the room was the note taker. Where do all prejudice stem from?
What would Dorothy Vaughan have answered if she was asked that question?
Well, maybe the same as me. I don't know.
Do you think there was things missing from the film? Do you think it could have gone deeper or further? You know, if it was 3 hours long, or dropped something else?
I think it would have been interesting to know actually where those prejudices did stem from. Why Jim Parsons was so prejudiced, for example. Where did that come from? Because that was never really explored, was it? Sorry, what was his? It wasn't Jim. What was his real name?
Paul Stafford, but he was a composite character made up of
Sheldon.
A number of individuals, but breaking them down. You're right. It would be nice to know why were they so.
And likewise, why was what's his name, Al Harrison, not so prejudiced? If they were from the same place with the same environment, why was he different?
Yeah, I got the impression that he was that was just below his kind of threshold of detection. He was so elevated in his thought processes and this sort of thing. He was just bound up in delivering what he had to deliver. That those sort of niceties passed him by, and that, you could almost see the awakening when the toilet scene came up. You did what, you had to do what, and that was nicely executed. That sort of awakening that there's stuff going on underneath his sort of area of perception.
In some ways, I like that there wasn't a reason shown. I think the film was a good length, and I think it included everything. But I think sometimes issues are so complicated and they go into a backstory, and then it's kind of, oh, well, the reason why they feel like this is because one time on the bus he was abused by a person of color, so therefore he now applies that, and that just isn't the reality. It's always just so complicated, and I think it could be quite powerful to kind of not be given a backstory. You just form your own opinions on why that might have been, without oversimplifying it. And that was something which I agree. I think it was nice that you had some people who were varying levels of, showing discrimination between them. But I quite like the fact that you never got a reason why, because that's kind of a lot closer to the reality we live in. People have unconscious biases, or people do have what they think is justifications, and they're nonsense. But you know, it's so complicated. It's quite nice to almost not simplify it to that.
You would hope, wouldn't you, that some younger minds might see the character played by Jim Parsons, Paul Stafford, and think, oh heavens, I'm not going to be like him. He was such a dislikable character that you would, you know, that people would see that and try to distance themselves, and like Peter was saying earlier, be more like the Kevin Costner, Al Harrison.
The sad thing is that, especially in research circles in science, and you can look at a lot of stories that come out, there are still lots and lots of supervisors who are putting their names on their female students' papers and work and passing it off as their own. This is not something that's been fixed. Yes,
yeah. There was clearly lots of anecdotes that have been compressed into his one character. Right, we're nearing the end. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. There's sometimes a danger when you over-examine a book or a film that then it can then spoil some of the original interest that you had in it. And I was going to ask whether you might consider, if there's a particular time or audience that you think that this film would come in at a good time. Like, for example, in a school, would you just sit a class in front of it and say, watch this for the next 2 hours? Or would you select certain people to watch it?
I think we don't have the privilege, unfortunately, of having 2 hours of lesson time. I just don't think SLT is going to buy that as a good lesson, to just sit for 2 hours. And we can't mandate that they have to come after school. But I would obviously promote it, particularly for the year 8 students, because I feel like the year 7s, you know, they're new, they're settling in. I think for year 8, they start to realise they're not the babies of the school anymore. And the year after this, when they make their subject choices, I think year 9 might be a bit too late. But I think year 8 to kind of just really like try to hook them in and really inspire them to consider GCSE as an option, which they can then confirm in year 9. But I would promote this to everyone. But if I could choose to have a film club of some sort and I had to limit to the year group, it would definitely be year 8s. And then if I'm going to really limit it, it would be to the girls, because I feel like a lot more boys take the subject, whereas unfortunately there's still fewer girls taking it. And hopefully films like this would just be one of many ways which might hook a few more in.
So, maybe we need to be fixing the men, not the girls. No. It's the men that need the educating and the boys, so that they make the girls feel welcome. We shouldn't be putting pressure on girls to stand up for themselves and try and break into a field that's not allowing them in. We should be training the boys to open that door and welcome the girls in. And that's certainly my view. Educating the dads, the brothers, the uncles, you know. But I'm not a school teacher, so I can't really answer your question. The last time we had an evening activity, we allowed the students to pick a film, and they chose Mad Max. That's what we ended up watching. But
I wondered, Adrienne, you were suggesting 12-year-olds, year 8. You're saying because in terms of their development and everything, you know, if you heard that a local cinema were putting it on a Saturday or on a Thursday evening or something like that, whether you might consider organising a group visit to go and watch the film, or you think no, that just would not work at all?
No, I think that would work. Like we've done, they do annual trips to Sky Cinema to watch different films. So maybe I can try to talk to Sky and try and encourage a film like this where it has a bit more of an educational purpose. And I think Cinderella they watched last year. But definitely I think a school trip as well. The nice thing about a school trip or school activity is that you can facilitate the conversations after. So they're not just watching it in their own homes, which isn't a bad thing either, because then they can discuss it with family. But obviously you've got a bit more control with the questions that you pose. And it can also be really interesting to listen to kids' conversations after they've watched the film and see what they take from it, and see if there's anything that you want to challenge or, you know, explore deeper. So yeah, I think that would be good if it ever did show in the cinema.
Just one thing to mention, Hannah has been very chatty in the chat. Thank you, Hannah. She's been making suggestions and recommendations. And one of them earlier on she mentioned was the Mercury 13 documentary that's on Netflix, and she put a link to that in there. Okay.
I wonder if there's a film in Stephanie Shirley's life.
Steve Shirley.
Yeah,
we're talking about.
Steve Shirley. Yeah, she's called Stephanie these days. But
I know, but she's still alive, isn't she?
She is, but by goodness me, she broke the mold, didn't she? And broke the glass ceiling big time.
Tell you what's happened recently that's very interesting is Durham University recruited Professor Sue Black, who was we did try and get her to come. I'm chair of the women's group at the university. We did try and get her to come and talk to us, but she's very expensive. And their numbers of women on the computer science courses have risen. I can't remember the exact number, but it could be up to 20%, which is a drastic rise. But her remit as a professor was just to increase the number of women on the course. So it makes a really big difference if you make it a priority, but you've got to put your money where your mouth is, which is what they've done. But you know, if Steve or Stephanie wants to come and work for us, then by all means.
I'm not sure what she charges.
Well, I don't know. Maybe Adrienne would probably be more experienced in this. Do kids want to see? I guess it's difficult because they probably want to see people closer to their age as role models.
Yeah, I did a research paper on role models to increase female engagement in computer science because it really was a big passion of mine in my last school. And the psychology of role models is quite complicated, but I think it's why I like this film as well, because basically what it says is that the kids have to see someone that's being aspirational but not being so far off their reach that they can't attain it themselves, and they need to have similarities between them. So obviously when we was talking about the Hidden Figures films and you were saying about showing it to the boys I agree with benefit from it, but I feel like the girls will be able to identify their similarities with them as role models. And I know for me, when I joined my previous school, I was their first female computer science teacher, and the girls responded so much more positively to me than the male teachers before, purely because I was a female. And they were like, "Miss, it's so weird. Like, we've never had a female computing teacher." And then the numbers really increased for those that wanted to do it. Now, that could be because of the lessons, or it could just be because it just kind of like challenges their beliefs. If they've always had computing teachers from primary school into secondary school teachers that are male, then it kind of reinforces that misconception that computing is only for guys, boys.
There's a danger though that they start rolling you out every time they want to have a role model, isn't there? And it, you know, that's not what you're there for either. And I still believe actually it's truly about education and actually training the men to let us in rather than training the girls to push harder.
That's right. I mean, if we can, if by watching the film, if there's a few less males that behave the way that, what was he called? Jim Parsons, the actor, played Paul Stafford. If some people stop behaving that way, then it's a matter of time. You know, it's only a matter of time when you know, it's like be a ripple effect. And you know, because when Dorothy was, when Mary Jackson was in the court and she was fighting her corner, not everybody has got the same kind of fighting stamina that Dorothy or Mary had. So the less Paul Staffords there are in the world, then the better, you know, for all of us. Right. I'm going to suggest that we finish it there. So I'm going to go now and end the recording and thank all of our panelists, Nicky, Rohini, Adrienne, and Peter. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.